Hey everybody. So we are going to start a new unit, and this is kind of the last of our traditional units. We are going to wrap up with some stuff on Europe, but Japan is kind of the last of our typical ninth grade units. And then um, in a normal year, the end of the year would be kind of a preview of European studies, um, primarily because that's what's going to lead into 10th grade. And it all depends on whether or not you're taking AP European Studies or if you're taking the regular 10R. Um, in the past, it was a pretty clear and seamless line. But so anyway, what we're going to do is we're going to wrap up our typical regional studies with the history of Japan. And then we will do some stuff with Europe to round out the year. So I hope this video finds everybody doing well. Um, I will attach with this also a notes and concept sheet, which is basically a series of questions with some video links that you can or can't watch. Doesn't really matter. It's totally up to you. And keep in mind that those notes, presentations, not those presentation notes, don't always have the answers embedded right in the content. You may have to do some outside research. Um, so let's get started with the history of Japan. So we've already had an assignment that deals with feudal Japan, and I think the one that I posted today is also going to deal kind of with the opening of Japan. So you probably already have a little bit of background. If you've done those assignments, you have some background on some of the information that we're going to talk about here. I'm going to see how long this takes. I may break this into two separate videos like I had with China and Southeast Asia. But I'm going to wait and see if I can get through the whole thing here, and it doesn't take too long. Then I'll just do it all in one. Otherwise, I'll create a second video for you to check out in a little bit. All right. So first of all, let's talk about geography. It's not necessarily here in the notes, but the geography of Japan is that of an archipelago. So it's broken up into thousands of islands with five main islands off the coast of China and Korea, off the Korean peninsula. So the location of Japan is going to have a huge impact on how its cultural development takes place. First of all, it's very isolated, and we talked about isolation and geographic barriers and the issues that can arise due to that. So the Japanese are going to, on one hand, develop a very unique identity. They're going to develop a very unique cultural identity and some very unique practices. However, because of their proximity to the Korean Peninsula, and to China, we're going to have the earliest influences from outside coming from those places. So early on in Japanese culture, we're going to have development of unique things like Shindo. So Shindo is the kind of the indigenous religion of Japan, and it really is a religion that's similar to animism, the idea that there are spirits that exist in the world. In animism, it's really more when we talked about Africa and we talked about animism, we talked about the idea that spirits inhabit like animals. In Shindo, it's more that spirits exist in nature. So it's not specific to the animals, but it's there can be spiritual places where the gods reside, like a beautiful place in nature, a beautiful waterfall, an island like a mountain like Mount Fuji. These are places that have spiritual meaning to the traditional Japanese religion of Shindo. Embedded as part of this is the idea of these spirits, and they are referred to as kami or kami. And these are the spirits that would then dwell in these places throughout the environment. So we're going to talk about several different time periods within Japanese history. And the key thing I want you to understand here is these are not dynasties. So when we talked about China, we talked about the ways in which the dynastic cycle worked, and we referred to the time periods by the dynastic rule of whatever family was in power. Traditionally, not always, but traditionally in Japanese history, what we're going to talk about is the location of the emperor. Basically, wherever the emperor was, that was the place that was the name of the period. So wherever the imperial capital was traditionally, that is going to be the time period. So the Yamato period is going to be when the capital early on, when the emperor's capital was in Yamato. So during this time period, the first kind of earliest time period in which we have recorded history, we're going to start to see a lot of influx from China. And you can see here some of the things that are going to have a little bit of an impact on Japan. Confucianism, excuse me, which the Japanese are going to adopt some Confucius values, but they're not going to adopt all of it. They're going to kind of do, and we'll see this throughout Japanese history, something called selective borrowing. So they're going to selectively take bits and pieces of things that really benefit them or that they find a value in, but they don't necessarily wholesale adopt everything. So when it comes to Confucianism, they'll take aspects of Confucianism that they find valuable, and then they will reject others, like a civil service exam, for example. And they just aren't interested in that. They don't see the value in that. So they basically develop their own uses for things like Confucianism. The written language, as you can see here in the picture that we have, the really unique thing about Japanese or Chinese characters is that they are used throughout Asia as base characters, and local languages are essentially applied to those. When we look at Buddhism, we talked about Theravada and Mahayana Buddhism several times throughout the course. So Buddhism will come to Japan, but in Japan, it's going to mix with Shindo, and we're going to end up with a separate type of Buddhism that we're going to talk about in a minute called Zen Buddhism. And then a lot of Chinese art, architecture, and some governmental structures are also going to be adopted by the Japanese during this time period. The next major period is the Heian period. So this is kind of the most important kind of flowering time period of Japanese culture to a certain extent. So this is kind of like the earliest period in which we're going to have a real clear establishment of Japanese culture as it begins to thrive. During this time period, we're going to have a wealthy group that is going to, of landowners who are going to live on very large landed estates and who have a lot of free time. And throughout history, when people have free time, what do they do with their time? They spend it doing other things, leisure activities, arts, architecture, coming up with new innovations and inventions. So we see that during the Heian period as well. And the key thing here during a couple things during the Heian period, first of all, we're going to start to have the development of a court life, which is essentially the life around the emperor and his family, the existence of other families that are aligned with the emperor and his family, and the ways in which it's kind of a formal setting of how the emperor's court is run and who runs it and who's involved and who's in and who's out and those kinds of things. The other major thing we're going to see here is early narratives being written. And you can see two of them right here. First of all, we have personal diaries like the Pillow Book, which is literally a woman's diary that explains day-to-day life during the Heian period, which then is printed and sold later on. The other is the development of some novels, and this is written by a woman by the name of Lady Murasaki Shikibu. The Tale of the Genji is an epic poem, essentially. It's an epic novel that is written, and the key part here is that these are things that are written by women. Women in Japan are going to be the earliest writers, the earliest novelists. So they're going to be the ones that, because they are women of the upper class, they have time, they are educated, they're literate, and they in some cases devote their time to writing, creating stories, doing, writing poetry and those kinds of things. But also during this time period, we're going to start to see the Japanese move a little bit away from the Chinese model of how to do things and start to develop their own unique Japanese systems here. So this is how the Japanese feudal society is set up. This is essentially the social pyramid top down, and there's a few major components that I want to point out here. So on the right-hand side, where it says feudal society, and we have figurehead warrior class, 90%, and lowest class. Those are the key components here. So these are the main structures of Japanese society. At the top, you have an emperor. That emperor is descended from the previous emperor. And the one unique thing about Japanese society, we do not have a dynastic cycle. The current emperor of Japan, and there is a current emperor of Japan today, is descended from the first emperor of Japan. They've never gone from one family rule to another. And a lot of that has to do with historically the divinity aspect of the Japanese emperor is very different from the Chinese aspect. There wasn't this mandate of heaven concept. It was just the emperor was essentially a god on earth. And so, and he was descended from a goddess. And it was like impossible to really remove the emperor and have another family take over. So at the very top, we have the emperor. And then below the emperor, we have the entire warrior class, or what's referred to as the samurai class. So at the top of the samurai class, you have the shogun. Shogun is the supreme general. All right, this is going to be the key military leader, but then eventually, oftentimes, also a political leader. We'll have the daimyo, who are the large landowners, similar to a lord in the European model. We then have the samurai, who are the warriors, the similar to the knights in European feudalism. We then have a separate classification for what are called ronin. So ronin are essentially samurai who've lost their master, their daimyo, either because that daimyo was killed or they were ousted from being the samurai for that daimyo because of something that occurred. And so these ronin would essentially be samurai for hire. People would be able to hire these ronin from time to time if they needed additional warriors or additional soldiers, or if they had a need to defend a certain plot of land, or in a very famous movie called The Seven Samurai, where a small village hires a bunch of ronin to come and protect their village. So that's kind of they're kind of a disgraced, to a certain extent, a disgraced group of samurai warriors who make their living by selling their skill set. Below the ronin and the entire samurai class, we're going to have the peasants. And so the peasants in Japanese society, similar to Chinese society, have a decent living. They aren't at the bottom of the social structure like you would find in a place like Europe. The peasant are kind of a middle class. They make up the bulk of the population. And below the peasants, we have the artisans, and then eventually the merchants. And we've seen this in other places as well. The artisans, important. They're creating goods, but they're not creating and producing food, which is more important than a lot of the other things. The merchants, on the other hand, were seen as simply kind of leeching off of other aspects of society. So the merchants would be taking the goods that are produced by artisans and the food that's produced by the peasants, buying it from them, and then selling it for a profit. And so providing a service, but not necessarily doing that through a means of creating something and doing something on their own. So a lot of the times the merchants would be frowned upon or seen as having very low status in society, simply because they weren't producing anything, but they were providing something. And there was a difference in Japanese culture about how those things were valued. So these are some of the rules in the samurai class. And I mentioned some of these in the notes, and I want you to kind of consider where it says why here. I want you to answer some of these questions. I'm not going to give you answers right now, but I do want you to note these. But within the samurai class, all marriages had to be approved by the shogun. And that really has to do with control, right? So the shogun, the supreme political leader or military leader, would have to approve all marriages within the samurai class. Also, samurai were forbidden from marrying outside of their social class. They couldn't marry a peasant. They couldn't marry an artisan or a merchant. That was prevented. And they were the only ones who could dress as a samurai. So the idea there is social identity through dress, right? So these samurai had the right to do certain things like wear specific types of clothing, wear specific designs of clothing. As it says here, they were able to carry two swords. Those two swords were a long sword and a short sword, or a dagger. The long sword, so both could be used during fighting, but the long sword was really more of a defensive and military type sword. The short sword could be used in close combat, but also could be used for a ritual called seppuku, ritual suicide, that we'll talk about here in a minute. And then they also all had to take a loyalty oath to their daimyo and to the shogun, basically a public statement that they would support them. And this was just to reinforce that connection and the bond. So all of these all together really are about control, and creating an insular class, a class that's not divided and outwardly kind of moving in its own directions, but to keep everybody kind of within one set system. So the next two slides are going to show us how feudalism worked in Japan, and then also a comparison to Europe. You can see here that first we provide a definition. Feudalism is a political, economic, and social system. It's not one or the other. It's everything combined, and it's based on loyalty and land or money or military service. And so at the top of this model, you can see here we have in Japan, we have the shogun. The shogun grants land to the daimyo for service. The daimyo can then grant land to the samurai, and then the samurai will then provide the peasants with the land to work in order for them to survive, also probably with, the goods that are necessary and shelter and those kinds of things. On the other side of this equation, we have, from the peasants moving up to the shogun, you have this whole idea of loyalty. At the bottom, it's food, but that's also, the peasants would also help to protect the land. So this is a system that really relies on the provision of the goods necessary, the means necessary for survival through land, and in return, loyalty for having provided that, right? So it's a system that, if anything is most important here, it's the loyalty aspect, but the reward for loyalty is land and sustenance. We have a similar situation in Europe. So you can see if you go between the two of these, it'll just provide you with a simple setup of how these were similar. Rather than an emperor, we have a king. Rather than a daimyo, we have lords. Rather than samurai, we have knights. And we still have peasants. But it also is based on the same exact principles of loyalty and land. This slide, you can take a look at this, and I do have on the question sheet, I have some questions about this. So take a look when you get an opportunity. The Code of Bushido is the ethical code that the samurai lived by. The Code of Chivalry is the ethical code that knights in Europe lived by. And so the main idea here overall, the overarching idea, is that these were not like indiscriminate killers who were bloodthirsty out killing people. These were people who lived by a code, a very specific social code. And under this code, there were certain expectations of everybody who was a samurai or a knight, that they would conduct themselves in certain ways, that they would take care of people who were lesser than them, that they would maintain their loyalties to people who they've devoted their loyalties to. So you're going to see that in each of these there are some unique aspects, but then there are some very similar ones in the center part of this Venn diagram where we have both. You can see there are a lot of things that are both restricted to or for the samurai and the knights, but also that are similarities that we see between the two of them, because they are extremely similar for being so far apart. Around the same time period, they developed very similar practices and purposes. So I mentioned seppuku before. Seppuku is ritual suicide. There is a video that you can watch if you wish to. You don't have to watch any of the videos that I posted, but they are quite informational, but they're totally optional. But seppuku is really just it's a ritual form of suicide, and we have to think of suicide in a different context than our American or Western cultural context of suicide. in Japanese culture, suicide is not necessarily a bad thing. It's almost an expectation in some circumstances. So seppuku is ritual suicide. It's a ritualistic practice of taking your own life when you've made a mistake, or when you've brought shame upon, let's say, your daimyo, your lord, or upon your family. And it was an expectation. It was an expectation that you would end your life because you did something wrong. So we have the process for seppuku, which involved the ritual or a religious aspect to it, where it was very formalized how the process in most cases would take place. And the basic idea is that short sword that samurai were allowed to carry, they would essentially plunge that into their abdomen, make a movement across the abdomen to do as much damage as they could to vital organs, and that would eventually lead to them bleeding to death. The right-hand side of this slide, we have people called kaishaku. The kaishaku would be what are called the seconds or the assistants. These were people you generally a very close friend of, or brother of the person who was committing seppuku. And it was this person's job to, first of all, oversee this and to be supportive. But also oftentimes when the person would plunge the dagger into their abdomen, the kaishaku would finish them off, so to say, by cutting their head off or something like that, so that they would not suffer. So the kaishaku was a very trusted person that you wanted to have there so that you wouldn't have to suffer in your final moments. Seppuku is going to have a major cultural impact on Japan up until today, as far as the whole idea of suicide, the acceptance to a certain degree of suicide, and the levels of suicide, whether it be through the kamikazes that we'll talk about later on with World War II, or in modern Japan with high levels of suicide as a result of a lot of the things that have happened there economically. Buddhism in Japan, as I mentioned before, also comes to Japan through the Korean Peninsula and China. In Japan, it's going to mix a little bit with Shindo, and we're going to have a practice called Zen Buddhism, which is a distinct version of Buddhism. It's a variation on Mahayana Buddhism, which is the non-monastic form of Buddhism. And it really works with both typical meditation, it's kind of that sound mind-body meditation, but also active forms of meditation like maintaining a Zen garden, kind of where you take something and you mess it up and you set it straight again. And what it does is it focuses the mind actively. So rather than just the simple close your eyes, deep breathing exercises, it's more about mental focus and breathing while you're actively doing something. So it could be a Zen garden, it could be archery, which takes a lot of focus and breathing and things like that. But it tries to incorporate as much as possible nature, the nature aspects of Shindo, and the focus and breathing aspects of Buddhism for focusing the mind and the body on a task that kind of brings about mindfulness. The next stage is the Ashikaga age. And this is going to lead up to some of the most dramatic changes that we're going to see in Japanese history. So we're going to see a shift during this time period of power from the emperor to the shogun. So the shogun, in the time leading up to the Ashikaga age, you're going to start to develop a lot more power. But at this point, Japan is still pretty diverse. It's pretty spread out. There is no unification yet of one large Japan. You have different shogun in different parts of the country who have power. But as we start to see more and more of these regions start to join together and form alliances, you're going to start to see powerful shogun rise up. And some of these shogun, particularly in the area around the emperor, are going to gain a lot of power and kind of supplant the power of the emperor or use the emperor as a puppet in order to have a lot of their personal gains looked after. We're also going to start to have the arrival of Europeans, primarily like we talked about in China and Southeast Asia. The early Europeans are going to be the Portuguese and the Dutch. The Christian aspect to this is going to play out similar to what we saw in Japan, kind of a pushing back against Christianity, and eventually the Dutch are going to be permitted to trade, but the Portuguese are not, primarily because of that aspect of missionary work between the Catholic Church and the Protestant churches. During this time period, we also have 3 unifiers. So these are basically 3 shogun in a row who coexisted at the same time, but all who had different parts in unifying all of Japan under one rule. So the first is Obu Nobunaga. He is going to be the last shogun who overrules the Ashikaga shogun, and he's going to unify a large part of Japan, and I'll have a map for that in a second. Right there it is. So you can see Japan after Nobunaga, and so Nobunaga basically controls all of the areas that are in green. The next one is going to be Hideyoshi, and then the last one, which is here in the brown, which is kind of controlling much of the area around the capital. And then the last unifier is going to be Tokugawa, who controls much of this purple section. So we have Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who's going to be the second unifier. He's going to take over after Nobunaga, and he's going to order all the European missionaries expelled from Japan. So as the Portuguese are coming in and they're bringing in missionaries, there's going to be this pushback against Christianity by the powers that be. Some of the peasants are going to welcome it, but the larger shogun, emperor powers are going to push back against this. Hideyoshi will take some of that unification a little bit further, and then eventually he is going to be superseded by Tokugawa Ieyasu. So Tokugawa is going to be the emperor who really joins everything together. He's going to be the final unifier. He's going to gather all power under himself and unify all of the islands of Japan under one set of rules and one centralized government. Now, it's important to understand that there is an emperor during this time period, but that the emperor's power has really been stifled by the shoguns, who are really the true political leaders during this time period. This slide I'm going to leave for you. It's part of the questions that I want you to answer, but a little background on this. It's basically an old tale about how these 3 unifiers ruled differently and why they were able to get what they want. So read through this one and answer the questions based on that on your sheets. So with the rise of Tokugawa Ieyasu, we're going to see the creation of the Tokugawa shogunate, which is going to be probably the most powerful shogunate. And so a shogunate is basically just ruled by a shogun. Similar to a khanate is the rule by a khan. The Tokugawa shogunate, during this time period, we're really going to start to see a flourishing of Japanese culture. So we're going to have 2 major things that are going to be happening. We have a flourishing of Japanese culture, a rise in the samurai class. Eventually, also the merchant class will start to rise. But we also start to have impact from outside of Japan. And so this is going to create both some conflict and some opportunities for different groups of people. So Japan's going to close off all trade to everybody except for the Dutch and the Chinese, because the Dutch agree to the terms of the Japanese shogun, which is essentially you can trade here as long as you don't bring missionaries and try to convert people. This is restricted to one island in Nagasaki Harbor. And so similar to what we saw in China, where trade was all taking place in southern ports away from the capital, Nagasaki is a little bit further south and away from the capital, and also restricted to an island where they don't have access to a lot of people. We have persecution of Japanese Christians. There were some people who did convert to Christianity here in Japan during this time period. All the power is centralized in the Tokugawa shoguns. we have a policy called the alternate attendance policy. The alternate attendance policy was basically a separation of samurai families, particularly daimyo families, in order to assure allegiance. So oftentimes your family would be able to stay on your estate while the daimyo was in Edo or Tokyo. And then when the daimyo would return to their landed estate, a member of the family would have to go to Edo in their place. So essentially what that did was it held a hostage. The shogun basically maintained power through kind of threatening the death of a loved one if somebody tried to rise up or join powers with somebody else to ally against him. We're going to start to see trade start to flourish. We're going to see a lot of cities start to grow during this time period as modernization starts to take place. The merchants, as I mentioned, they start to gain a lot of wealth and they start to become very rich. Now, they don't gain status, but eventually they're going to gain so much money that they have a lot of power. And then also during this time period, which is a pretty peaceful time period, we're going to have the rise of new different art forms like haiku poetry, which is very specifically metered, and kabuki theater. All right. I'm actually going to end this video right here at this point. This is kind of a long one. So I'm going to end this one and I'll pick up with the next one right after this.